Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Morgan. I'm Lyndon Chubin. I'm the Director of Education, and we're delighted to present Professor Alexander Jones and Roger Wick in a program related to Now and Forever, the Art of Medieval Time. I hope that you've had an opportunity to see this stunning exhibition that explores how people in the Middle Ages told time, conceptualized history, and conceived of the afterlife. It is on view through April 29th, and the gallery will be open following tonight's program if you didn't have a chance to catch it beforehand. There's also a companion book, The Medieval Calendar, available in the Morgan shop during regular museum hours, or you can go to our website and order it there. Before introducing our speakers, I want to remind you that on April 13th, the composer Eve Beglarian and her ensemble present a multimedia performance called Songs from a Book of Days that draws inspiration from medieval sources, sonic, visual, and textual. So please pick up our calendar of events and check out our website for information on all of our current exhibitions, concerts, and programs this season. And note that we have rescheduled 2 talks in April due to the recent storms this month, one with Sidney Babcock on collecting the past and David Freeberg on Power and Grace, which is an exhibition of Flemish drawings. The format tonight will be 2 back-to-back talks by our speakers, followed by a short audience Q&A, and we'll begin with Professor Jones and then curator Roger Wick. Alexander Jones is the Leon Levy Director of the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World and Professor of the History of Exact Sciences and Antiquity at New York University, where he has taught since 2008. He studied classics at the University of British Columbia and the history of the ancient mathematical sciences in the Department of History of Mathematics at Brown University. Before coming to NYU, he was for 16 years on the faculty of the Department of Classics and the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Together with Christine Proust, he curated the 2011 exhibition on Babylonian mathematics before Pythagoras, and in 2016, the exhibition Time and Cosmos in Greco-Roman Antiquity. And Professor Jones's scholarship centers on the history and transmission of the mathematical sciences, especially astronomy. He is the author of several editions of Greek scientific texts, among them Pappus of Alexandria's commentary on the corpus of Hellenistic geometrical treatises, known as the Treasury of Analysis, an anonymous Byzantine astronomical handbook based on Islamic sources, and a collection of about 200 fragmentary astronomical text tables and horoscopes that were excavated about a century ago. He is a member of the American Philosophical Society, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and a recipient of many awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Francis Bacon Award in the History of Science. Roger Wick is the Morgan's Melvin R. Seaton Curator and head of the Department of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts. He is the curator of the exhibition Now and Forever, the Art of Medieval Time, and since coming to the Morgan, he has curated 12 important exhibitions and written or contributed to their accompanying publications. The topics of these shows include contemporary Hebrew illumination, the art of Master of Claude de France, the Eucharist in medieval life and art, and the fashion in medieval France and the Netherlands. His 2001 show on Jean Poyet was the first ever one-man show in America devoted to an illuminator. And he wrote the book in 1997, Painted Prayers, for his exhibition, Medieval Bestseller, that has become a standard reference for books of hours. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Jones and Roger Wick in Whatever Happened to the Ides of March.
Thank you very much. So my part in tonight's festivities is to give something of the ancient background to medieval time management, time reckoning on the scale of days, months, and years, essentially calendar scale time. So part of this is going to be about the Roman calendar before it became the medieval Western European calendar, but also I'm going to say some more general things about ancient calendar scale time reckoning. So I'd really like to start just with the basic fact about early calendar structures, that they are very much driven by natural phenomena and particularly astronomical phenomena. The sort of naturally existing ways of partitioning time are basically two things that are pretty obvious. One is the cycle of days and night. The sun rises in the morning, it sets in the evening, then you have night, and then you have another day. And that is the short cycle of human lives. And then on a bigger scale, you have years. Years in a kind of natural sense, which are the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of agriculture that's dictated by the seasons and the growth cycles of plants and animals. If you want to turn it into something a little more objectively measurable, you can look at the way that the sun rises on the eastern horizon, which is not always in the same point, but oscillates between a southern limit and a northern limit through the year. So that gives you a cycle of turning points, which in the Greek word for turning, trope, gives us the idea of a tropic or a solstice. So a year can be defined in terms of that cycle of the sun seeming to move north and south. And then a third way you can define years is by looking at the constellations that you can see in the night sky, which are changing through the year. The constellations you see first in the evening after the sun set and it gets dark enough to see stars at all. The constellations you see late in the night just before the sun rises are correlated with the stage of the year. So here are three different ways, one of them more environmental and the other two more astronomical for saying that a year passes. So why do years matter? Well, in ancient cultures, there are a number of reasons. One of them is the agricultural cycle itself, which of course is fundamental. I put that as the third on the list, but it really is where everything else comes from. But the reason that years become regulated at an official sort of state level is because tied to the agricultural year, you get cycles of religious festivals, which are often associated with things like the harvest season, so they should happen at a certain stage of the season. So there's not much point in having a harvest season in the springtime. Civil administration, often when you have cities in which the people who are magistrates of the city change office every year, and private business gets regulated by years as well. So there are all these different reasons why it's convenient to think of time on the larger scale as being partitioned into years as the bigger cycle of time. But it's a big gap between the length of a day and the length of a year. There are about 360 some days in a year, so that's a long count of days. So it's helpful to have something intermediate between the two. And again, basic observational astronomy offers something that is between the two, which is the cycle of the phases of the moon. So if you're watching the moon day by day, you can start the cycle with the first evening where you see the new moon crescent in the western sky setting just a little bit after the sun sets. And then every night after that, the moon will get a little bit fatter in its crescent until you get to a full moon, and it's getting further and further away from the sun in the sky, so that when you get to full moon, the moon rises while the sun sets, and then you have the moon waning. And that whole cycle takes either 29 days or 30 days, always a whole number if you're starting with an evening observation of the moon. So if you were to take the average over a long time, you'd find it's pretty close to 29 and a half days. But if you're using observations of the new moon crescent to decide when months start, you're not going to get a neat alternation 29, 30, 29, 30. You'll sometimes get two 29s in a row. Sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 30 days in a row. So it's not quite a regular alternation. And besides, it's just a tiny fraction more 30-day months than 29-day months. So if you want to build a calendar out of these things, the day, the lunar month, and the year, coming from astronomy or from nature, there are going to be a couple of challenges. Sorry, I didn't go to the next slide. There we are. A couple of challenges in doing this. One of them is it's always helpful to have some idea in advance of when a new time unit is going to start. That's particularly true if you're going to, say, have market days tied to it or religious festivals tied to it. You don't want to be taken by surprise by a new month. So how are you going to determine your new months? You can use observation. As you say, we'll start the new month when we see that new moon crescent, but then you have no way of being sure it will be tomorrow night or the next night. You can try to develop some sort of an astronomical theory for predicting when the new moon crescent is going to be visible. And to do that well, it's pretty complicated. You need to know quite a bit effectively about the orbit of the moon around the Earth and about the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Not just how long it takes, but what are the little variations involved. And that is something that in ancient times some people did learn how to do reasonably well, but it is complex mathematical calculation. And then there's a third solution, which is simply to spread out the 29 and 30-day months as evenly as you can, which means mostly just alternating. And don't worry about the fact that sometimes the new crescent will be visible not quite on the night you declared the month to begin. If you're willing to accept this of plus or minus 1 day, then that's probably the easiest solution. So that's one of the tricks in making a lunar calendar work. Another is reconciling months with years, because if the average month is 29 and a half days, and we know the average year is 365 and a bit days, they don't divide out nicely. You can fit 12 whole lunar months in a year, and you'll have about 11 days left over, because 12 lunar months is only about 354 days on average. So what are you going to do? If you want to keep your calendar simple, maybe you'll just say that the year will have 12 lunar months and not worry about it not quite making a natural solar year. That's how the Islamic calendar works, for example, that every year has 12 calendar months that are based on the phases of the moon. And that means that the months of the calendar gradually drift in relation to the seasons. Something that is tied to your calendar that this year happens in summer, a few years from now will be a springtime event, and so it will go until eventually it will come back around again. Most ancient calendars that use the phases of the moon do not do that. Instead, what they do is they will occasionally double one of the months. They'll say, okay, it would be as if we were to say we're going to have 2 Marches this year to keep our calendar in line with the seasons. And that can be done either on a kind of arbitrary basis whenever you sense that it's time to do it because your years are falling a little bit too early, or you can try to find some sort of a repeating cycle that will, in the long term, keep your calendar years in line with the natural years, but from year to year there'll be a little bit of wobble going on. So that cycle idea is where I want to begin with actual ancient calendars, with ancient Babylon and the Babylonian calendar, which was the type of calendar that ran off lunar months based on the phases of the moon, starting with the new moon crescent. But from about 500 BCE on, this calendar had its year lengths, the number of months in a year, regulated by a 19-year repeating cycle. So that out of those 19 years, you would have, trying to remember how many you have, you would have 7 years that have 13 months, and 12 years that have just 12 months. And in the 13-month years, you would have one of the months would be repeated. And that turns out to be a very good cycle. The equation of 19 solar years and 235 lunar months, as it comes to, is so close to being exactly right that you can use a cycle like that for several centuries and not sense that anything is starting to slip with the months and the years. Oddly, even though it was the Babylonians who seem to have discovered that cycle, the common name given to it is the Metonic cycle, which is named after a Greek astronomer of the later 5th century BCE, because the way that we learned about the cycle in modern times was through reading ancient Greek and Roman literature that credited Meton with this discovery. He may have learned it from connections with Babylonia. He may have discovered it independently, but he certainly was not the first. So if I talk about the Metonic cycle, that's what I mean, this 19-year cycle. So what about the calculating the month lengths, 29-day and 30 days? Again, the Babylonians are the pioneers here. They developed a very advanced mathematical astronomy that's based on basically spreadsheet techniques that use arithmetical functions to calculate all kinds of things going on with the movement of the moon in the sky, the movement in the sun in the sky, the angles of their apparent paths with relation to the horizon. And at the end of one of these spreadsheets, sort of at the right end, you get a calculation of which day is going to be the new moon crescent evening. So that you can get sense, even without reading this tablet, there's columns of numbers running to more than 20 columns to get to that result. So the Babylonians are doing this mathematically by about 300 BCE, but nobody picks this idea up in other cultures from them. In other cultures, a simple kind of alternation techniques gets used for lunar months. So what about the Greeks? Well, the Greeks are much more fragmented. There are many, many separate Greek city-states like Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, and each of them has its own distinctive calendar. There will be different names for the months, a different season of the year when the calendar year begins, different practices about which months get doubled to make 13-month years, different religious festivals that are tied to these months. They're based on variations in the local cult. And so you had the real confusion of different calendars, but they all operated on the same basic principles as the Babylonian calendar. They're using lunar months, they come to use 19-year cycles eventually. Though for a long time they're operating with a much more capricious sort of system in which whoever are the officials in charge decide whether they want to have a 13th month this year or not. The illustration I'm showing you at the bottom is fairly unusual for the Greeks' way of trying to illustrate a calendar. In this case, it's the calendar of ancient Athens in pictures. The pictures are relating to the various religious festivals that happened in the months of the year. So they're showing things like figures eating feast at tables that would be appropriate for that religious festival. And in amongst these images are also images of the 12 signs of the zodiac, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit, but they also correlate with the calendar months. This is this calendar frieze is an ancient frieze that by good fortune is preserved because it was built into the front of a medieval church in Athens that is a very pretty little church next to the big cathedral, modern building in central Athens. One more illustration of this Greek approach to calendars is the famous Antikythera mechanism. This was a gearwork astronomical simulating device that was found in very corroded fragments about 1901 in an ancient shipwreck site off the island of Antikythera, hence the name Antikythera mechanism. And it's now pretty well understood what this thing did and what it displayed. You had a knob on the side that you would turn to represent going forward in time, and all sorts of dials on the front and the back would show cycles of time and simulated movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. So on one of the dials on the back, it's the big spiral dial on the upper half of the back, was a calendar cycle that represented the 235 lunar months making up 19 calendar years of a particular regional calendar. This was the calendar of Corinth. And it operates with this 19-year cycle and with the idea of spreading out the 29 and 30-day months as evenly as you can among the 235 months. So no actual observational astronomy is needed if you have a calendar structured in this way. But those calendar years wobble a bit with respect to the seasons because the years aren't all the same length. Some are about 254 days, some are about 284 days. So some kinds of things you really want to have a more regular year for. And there was a Greek approach to doing this as well, which was to make calendars originally in stone inscriptions with little peg holes. And there would be a hole for each of the 365, maybe 366 days that would make up a natural astronomical year. So it's not connected with the months of the religious festival or legal documents or things like that, but it's used for predicting repeating weather patterns in a particular place and which constellations become visible and invisible in the night sky. Now, I mentioned the zodiac. That's another Babylonian thing in its origin, and it originated in Babylonian astronomy as a kind of way of being able to say in records where the moon and where the planets were observed to be on nights of year after year after year. For several centuries in Babylon, tablets were compiled and put away in an archive that recorded astronomical phenomena and weather and the zodiac came to be used as this kind of reference scale for positions of the moon and the planets. But it also became a part of astrology because each 12th of the zodiac, each sign named after a constellation that was more or less coinciding with that 12th, was supposed to have certain powers that would affect people's lives if they were born with the sun, moon, and stars in some kind of relation to that sign of the zodiac. That gets transferred into Greek astronomy and then becomes a part of the whole Greco-Roman way of thinking about cosmology. So it's partly a kind of spatial thing. It's a belt of constellations running around the system of stars in the sky. The famous Farnese Atlas statue in the Archaeological Museum in Naples is a Roman statue that shows Atlas holding a star globe with constellation pictures, and you can see that there's if I can get the pointer to show, there's a belt with two circles bounding it, and here's the ram for Aries, and then Taurus, the bull, and so on. So the constellations of the zodiac are running around that. So those are zodiacal signs as space things. But because the sun goes once a year through the signs of the zodiac, it also becomes a way of visualizing the passage of time through the year. And here you have an image that shows up in a number of ancient pictures and mosaics, and even on a coin from the time of Hadrian, where you have this standing naked figure is Ion. He represents long cycles of time, and he's holding a belt which has the 12 signs of the zodiac on it, which represent the cycle of the year, and by extension, the long cycles of regeneration that bring about golden ages. So, an emperor like Hadrian would use an image like this to represent the new golden age that coincides with his reign. So here we get these things combined with the Roman calendars I come to at last. This is an altar-like block which was found in the city of Rome, I think around the 16th century, and is now again in the Naples Archaeological Museum. And it probably was a stand for something like a sundial on the top. There's a sort of hole on the top that something was plugged into. But on the sides, you have 3 columns on each face, and you can see pictures of the 12 signs of the zodiac are above each of these columns. Below that, there's text written in Latin, and each one is a month of the Roman calendar. So the very first thing it says is mensis, mensis februar for February, mensis martius, and so on, so month of March. Then it says how many days in that month. Now this is the calendar, the Roman calendar as reformed by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. I'm not going to talk about the earlier Roman calendar, which is a horrible mess and is there are a lot of puzzles about it that we don't understand. But basically, the Roman calendar was a mess that did not keep well in line with seasons until the reforms that Julius Caesar brought in. These month lengths are the same ones we have. So March has 31 days in Roman numerals here. And then because March is a month that has, there are different lengths of the daylight in hours that are given. And this is basically our modern structure of the year, except that the way that days are named is not the modern way. Instead of counting 1, 2, 3 up, what you do is you mark 3 days in each month, which are like landmark days. The first day is called the calends, and then a few days later, it's not always the same number in every month, there is a date called the nones, and then 8 days after the nones is a date called the ides, which falls always around the middle of the month. The ides is effective, if these months were lunar months, the ides would be like the full moon day. But they're not lunar months because their lengths are not 29 and 30 days. They're lengths that are fixed always for the months, and the phase of the moon in different years will have a different cycle relative to them. So the ides is a kind of notional full moon, but not a real full moon. And the nones, the name means the 9th day before the ides. I said it was 8 days before, but the Romans have a funny way of counting that counts both ends. So when they count 9 days before, they start with the ides itself. And so you end up with the nones 8 days as we would count earlier. And then for all the other days in between, they're named according to how many days it is until the next landmark day. So days before the nones will be called, third day before, and then the day before, because of this funny way of counting inclusively, and then you get the nones itself. And then you get counting up to the ides, and then the ides itself, and then you're counting up to the calends of the next month, and then the calends itself. So this backwards counting is quite, to us, peculiar. So you have these in here. You have, what else? Oh, well, you have which are the agricultural activities, the important agricultural activities that should be carried out in that month, and which major religious festivals happen in that month. In this case, the exact dates aren't given. This is probably basically a decorative object that was in somebody's gardens, so it wasn't used as a tool for keeping track of time like a wall calendar, but rather as a kind of decorative object that sort of commemorated the structure of Roman time. And the connection with the zodiac is nice because essentially each month is mapped onto a sign of the zodiac for whatever sign the sun is passing through most of that month. Images for, I was saying that it's very rare for Greek calendars to have visual imagery surviving. For the Roman calendar, it's very common. In particular, there are a lot of mosaics, especially from later Roman imperial times, that show the 12 months of the year. So here there are obviously too many here for months. But what you have is these three middle columns are 12 months, named in Latin, and with images that are showing kinds of activity that would be sort of emblematic of it. It might be, the harvest of grapes, or it might be new births of lambs or something like that. And then the four over here are just seasons of the year, so 3 months make a season, and these are just decorations here. So there are lots of such mosaics. This is one of the nicest preserved ones from Roman North Africa. This is a fragment of a stone inscription from somewhere in the neighborhood of Naples. Again, it's from the 1st century CE, so early Roman Empire. And it was a kind of pegboard calendar. You remember the one I showed you for the Greek solar year that would keep track of the cycle of weather and the constellations? Well, this is doing different cycles that probably have more to do with telling whether a day is good luck or bad luck. And the best preserved part of it is this column where you have 8 names of towns in the region of Campania in Italy with little peg holes next to them. And these represent an 8-day cycle, which was called the nundinal cycle, because in Latin that means the 9-day cycle, because again, the Romans would always count the first and the last as part of the cycle. And it was a cycle, among other things, of market days. That's what's been going on here. It operated in some ways the way the week does for us, as a short cycle of days that regulate certain things about life, including probably evaluating whether days are auspicious or inauspicious days for doing things. The other things that were shown on this inscription were over here, the sort of rosette thing had holes for 29 or 30 days for the lunar days, which are not part of the calendar. And then there was a peg hole for each season. And what's going on up here is something I'll come to just in a little bit, which is the 7-day week cycle. So the full complexity of the Roman calendar shows up in inscriptions like the one that this is just a little piece of. And this resembles some of the medieval calendars you're going to be seeing in part 2 of tonight's presentation. What you have here is a column or a whole set of columns for each month of the year. So here is the name of the month August. I have highlighted it with a little box. And by the way, that tells us this has to be it has to be during or after the reign of the Emperor Augustus that this inscription was made, because before that month was called Sextilis. So what more? Well, we have the K for the calends, the noni are the nones, and the adus is the ides of the month. So those are those landmark days. We have in Roman numerals, the backward count of days up to these landmark days. So these are the single days of the month. Then you have these 2 columns of letters. The one in the blue box, which is just cycling through A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. That's 8 letters of the alphabet starting from the beginning, and that's the nundinal cycle. So it doesn't give names of market towns, but it simply identifies 1 through 8 of the cycle. In the purple box, there are letters like C, N, and F, which are markers for whether these are days that were appropriate for, a day that's marked F is a fasti, as it's called. This is a day when you may initiate actions in the courts. A day that's marked N is nefastus. That's a day when you mustn't do that. And C comitialis means that this is a date when public assemblies may take place. So these are kind of evaluation of days according to appropriate legal activities, but also get connected with good and bad luck. And then this little text here is mostly religious festivals. In these inscriptions, sometimes you also get indications of historical events that, particularly unfortunate historical events like major lost battles that might become markers saying this day is a bad luck day forever. So quite a complex system. One more complexity to bring this picture of Roman time almost to a close is that there is a 7-day week as well, which shows up in ancient inscriptions. It's not the Judeo-Christian 7-day week. It is the astrological 7-day week, which was coming out of Greek astrology and a system that said every hour of the day, starting from sunrise, belongs to one of the sun, the moon, or the 5 planets that were known in ancient times. So that makes 7 in all. And they go in a cycle for the hours that is based on how far they were thought to be from the Earth. So the one that's farthest from the Earth in Greek astronomy is Saturn. So that's the first hour of the first day of a 7-day cycle. The days are governed by whatever planet governs the first hour of the day. And you end up with a cycle that goes Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, and so on. I put the cycle up there on the slide. And if you think about the names of the days of the week in English, some of these match up nicely, Sunday, Monday, but then we use Norse gods for some of the others. If you know the French days of the week, then it's easier to see the match. Mardi is Mars's day, and so on. Vendredi is Venus's day. So this was a cycle which happened to coincide with the Christian week later on, and in some parts of the post-Roman world became the standard names for weekdays, even though they were associated with pagan beliefs, not with Christian beliefs. So this is unfortunately lost because it was a kind of graffito inscription from ancient Rome at the Baths of Trajan. It got destroyed simply by weather almost immediately after it was discovered. And you see these 7 heads at the top. One of them's, a couple of them are broken away. But they are the 7 planetary divinities, Saturn, the sun, the moon, and so on, which are the weekdays, and there were little peg holes for them. And then you have the days of the lunar month here, and movement of the sun through the zodiac, probably for these. This is a very pretty little figurine that was found in Burgundy about 2 centuries ago, I guess, and is now in the British Museum, where you have a mythological figure, a god that's associated with protection, and the 7 weekday gods in their weekly order up on the top on this rather peculiar little thing that sits on her wings. So that's not the whole picture of ancient time, but these are the real landmarks that flow into the Middle Ages. As a kind of transition thing, I just want to show you this this rather nice, this is a big inscription on a kind of circular base, so that when you lay it down, it lies flat. And it was made in the late 4th century of our era, again, not far from Naples. And it was the local community's celebration of the fact that the Christian emperor of the time had given this area the permission to keep some of their pagan religious feasts, even though in most of the Roman Empire they had been made illegal and were being supplanted by the Christian year. So this is a kind of last gasp of the old pagan use of the Roman calendar. And with that, I'm going to pass the podium on.
So with my first slide, we jump from the 4th to the 14th century. And what I have is a typical medieval calendar. I'm going to be returning to this cyclically tonight. And it's actually in the exhibition upstairs. So when I finish speaking, you can actually go up and examine all the details that I'll be pointing out today. So I'm going to walk you through the structure of the medieval calendar. It's going to seem very familiar because the theme tonight is that the medieval calendar inherited a great deal from antiquity. And if you look at the left-hand side and count in to the 3rd and 4th columns, you can actually see the Roman calendar with which you are now, I assume, very familiar with. So here are the two columns I've separated. They occur here. And you see that it's the business that Alex was talking about, that each month, we happen to be in the month of July, consists of 3 fixed days, the calends at the first, the nones around the 7th or so, and the ides around the 15th or the 13th or so. And these are the countdown days, counting forwards to each fixed day. So this is the 8th day before the ides, the 7th before the ides, the 6th before the ides. The words ides is not repeated, but just abbreviated to id, and the nones is not repeated, it's just abbreviated to non. And here are the KLs as we march towards the calends of the next month, which will be August. But there's additional information that actually relates very much to what we've been learning, although it's been slightly repackaged, although its importance is actually carried forward from antiquity. On the far left of each calendar month, you see a series of numbers. You might expect what we have in our calendars today, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that enumeration of the days of the week never existed in the Middle Ages. They just did not use that system. They used the Roman calendar to mark their days and saints' feast days, and I'll come more to that. The column where we might expect the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a series of numbers. They're Roman numbers. They run 1 to 19, but they're not consecutive, and there are gaps, and you see them selected on the right-hand side. This, of course, relates to the 19-year Metonic cycle that Alex was just telling about. And what they track in every medieval calendar is the appearance, particular to a day, where all of these new moons begin to crescent and begin to build. How the system worked is that each year was assigned its own unique golden number, of course, that repeated every 19 years. So when you were in an 11 year, if you were an 11 year, you would know that all the new moons begin at that particular day in July, which you see is at the tip top. I think it's the equivalent of July 2. So these are the golden numbers, so-called golden, because you use them with this second column of information. Again, what we've learned, that it was already in use in antiquity. And you can see in the second column the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, repeating ad infinitum throughout the calendar, tracking, of course, the 7 days of the week. Now, another peculiar thing that happens with medieval calendars is that they are all perpetual. The very same calendar is used year in, year out. But it's with the Dominical letters that you can actually make a perpetual calendar specific to a specific year, because every year would be assigned a particular Dominical letter. So that, let's say, all of your B's, you were in a B year, you could go through your calendar, find all the B's, and you know that every B was a Sunday, all right? And therefore, using the simple logic, the C's would be Mondays, and so forth. So you can take a perpetual calendar and make it individual to a particular year. Now, the use of the golden numbers, I mentioned that phrase, was so called because they were very useful in finding the all-important date of Easter, which is about to happen. Easter was, according to the Christian Church, a movable feast that depended on both the solar cycle and the lunar cycle. You could use very complicated formula in the Middle Ages with the golden numbers and the Dominical letters and come to the date of Easter. Or you could use this simple chart. Let me turn it on its side, and actually, it really is simple. I worked with this. You have to know, first of all, and you would know this, your golden number, and you see them running here, 1 through 19, all right? You find your golden number. You also then, in the column on the right, find your Dominical letter, whether A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. And for each of those confluences, then you can find this chart, from this chart, 3 very important dates, but dates that change every year. For instance, you can find the date of the beginning of Septuagesima, which is the Latin term for Lent, or the date of Easter, named Pascha here, or the date of Pentecost, for every of the years of the Dominical letters. Now, if you find that just a tad confusing, I can tell you that there were easier ways as the Middle Ages transitioned into the Renaissance to find the date of Easter, and they simply made up charts that are very legible that we can read today, so that for every year from 1525 to 1550, the date of Easter is given right there, very simply, that you can read. The chart also nicely supplies us with the golden number, numerus aureus there, as it changes from year to year, going through 19, and then repeating itself starting again, and the particular Dominical letter that is assigned for every year. You might notice that every 4th year there's a second Dominical letter, and that's because at every leap year on the 26th of February, the Dominical letter changes, yet again making the system even more fun and complicated. Going back to the 14th century Bolognese calendar and walking through these various elements, there is yet another presence of what the Middle Ages inherited from antiquity, and that is this concept that there were bad luck or evil days. And almost every calendar has 2 of them marked. There's one and there's one, and I've highlighted them here on the right, with a big D for Dies Aegyptiaci, which means the Egyptian day, because anything coming out of Egypt has got to be a little weird. So they were also called the Dies Mali, meaning bad day, day of evil, whence we get our adjective dismal. So on those days in the Middle Ages, you would not, let's say, start on a journey or go to the doctors to be bled or have a important business transaction. So if you told time in the Middle Ages according to the Roman calendar, the second way you told time was by the feast day, and the bulk of the calendars were made up of the feasts. And again, this is something that the Middle Ages inherited from antiquity, only of course these are going to be Christian festivals, not what the Middle Ages would consider pagan festivals. Now, if you think it's weird to tell time by the feast day, we actually do it today. So if I say, let's go hear the carols under the Rockefeller Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, or if I say, let's be really wild and take our kids and celebrate New Year's Eve in Times Square, or I'm still feeling woozy from all the chocolate I ate on Valentine's Day, or how much green beer did you drink on St. Patrick's Day? You all know what exactly day I'm talking about. You have been telling time in the medieval way, which is by the festivity, the Saint's Day, or the liturgical feast on that day. It's just in the Middle Ages they did it a lot more. They knew their saints in the Middle Ages. This is a very odd and rare small calendar. The leaves are about the size of a credit card, each of them. It's very dark, so on the right-hand side, I have a photoshopped image of what the object is on the left. It's a calendar in runes, and you can make out some of those runes. There are no saints' names written anywhere in the calendar, but the saints, the feasts, are represented by pictograms, little pictures that have been engraved onto the surface of the ivory. It consists of ivory or walrus tusk. It's actually fairly easy to figure out the major feasts. Here, for instance, is an angel approaching a woman, and on the scroll of the angel, it kind of is a little garbled, but it says Ave Maria. And if you follow the little line going down from the woman's hem to this rune and count from over here, you get to 25. And it's pretty easy to figure out that that's March 25, the Feast of the Annunciation. There's the Feast of St. George, for instance. It's pretty easy to figure these out when they have a complete picture, but I have to confess to you that When it's just a little head or a crozier, it's a little bit more challenging to figure out exactly whose feast day it is. So, the calendar consists of a lot of feasts, and as you see, you can read even from the distance there that most of them are written in black or brownish ink, and some of them are written in red ink. So here at the bottom is Germani, or we would say Germanus. The feasts are always in the genitive because it's understood that the phraseology is, this is the feast of Germanus, so it's Germani. Now there were additional informations given for the feast of Germanus. That's because in the Middle Ages there were so many saints who had the same name that when they were entered on a calendar, they had to be given a kind of job description so you could distinguish one Germanus from another. So this Germanus happens to be an epi and a confess, which is an abbreviation in Latin for bishop and confessor. Confessor is not someone who sat around hearing confessions all day. Confessor was the name given to a saint who did not suffer martyrdom. Some of the feasts are written in red. They are literally the red-letter days. In other words, the more important events, and we still sometimes use that expression today. So this calendar, our Bolognese calendar on the left, is graded in two colors, black and red. So it's double graded. The purpose of grading is, of course, to distinguish the more important feasts from the lesser important. But other complex will be, let's say, triple graded. In this case, blue, the Feast of Our Lady, is in blue, and the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross are in blue. That is the number 1 color. Those feasts are more important than the green feasts. Here's Ramoclis, another confessor. And then the third and lower range of feasts are those written in red. And then it continues. So that was a triple graded calendar. This is a quadruple graded calendar. The most important color in this is blue, again, so we go here. The Feast of the Nativity, the birth of John the Baptist. The second, the B grade, is kind of a purple. Here's the Feast of the Commemoration of St. Paul. Then we get red for the third color, Peter and Paul, and black for all the other feasts. This happens to be an English calendar from the mid to late 15th century. And when I point out here a black letter feast of Sancti Leonis, Saint Leo, you might notice that there's something smudged after his name, and that is an erasure that originally said Pape, or Pope. And this is an example of an English calendar that actually was still in England during the Reformation and establishment of the Church of England, when, if you owned a Book of Hours, you were ordered by Henry VIII to scratch out the word Pope throughout, because you could celebrate the feast of Saint Leo, but not as the Pope, but as the Bishop of Rome. And in this French 15th century calendar, it looks as if it's triple graded. We have in the middle of the month Saint Denis there in gold. It looks brown to you, but it doesn't photograph nicely. And then all the other feasts are either in red or blue. As I said, it looks like a triple graded calendar, but it is not. This, you have to beware. This is false triple grading. And that is the use of red and blue as a decorative alternating color, but as you see, they alternate very neatly and regularly. So actually, this is only a double-graded calendar, camouflaged as a triple-graded calendar. And then there are calendars that actually don't have any grading, and this is a case. It looks as if it's double-graded in gold and blue, but notice again, they alternate very neatly, and actually this calendar is not graded at all. And that's actually very, very rare. So it actually wasn't enough to color code your calendar, because that didn't give you enough information when more than one feast would fall on one day, which was an extremely common occurrence in the medieval church. You had to have a system where every feast was ranked so that you knew when two or more feasts would fall on one day, which one took precedent. So in addition to color coding your calendar, they were often also, each feast was giving a rank. In the case of our Bolognese calendar, there are feasts such as Mary Magdalene, who was a red letter day. She's also a dupe, which means duplex. Here's another feast that's a dupe. James is also a dupe. Dupes were better than simps, which were simplex, okay? And simps were better than a 3-lesson day, which is just like, which is referring to the number of lessons that you would read in matins. In another calendar, this calendar is a wild, wild calendar that actually has 12 different ranking shadings. That is the most I've ever found. And they start with triplex, triple here, and then we get duple, duplex, and then we get 9 lessons, and then we fall back to 3 lessons, and then we get very minor feasts that are just marked ME for Memoria. But as I said, this calendar is actually a ranking in 12 different shades, which is the most I've ever seen. When we return to the Bolognese calendar, there's one aspect which I haven't mentioned, which was also touched upon by Alex, which is the pictures at the bottom. And these also are inheritance from the Middle Ages. So each month has often a picture or two, and when it has 2 pictures, as the Bolognese calendar has, it has a vignette of the zodiacal sign that is particular to that month. You remember that Alex touched on that. This refers to the sign that the sun enters right before it rises. And as that belt of the zodiacal constellation spins around the earth, every month roughly, the sun is entering a different one of these zodiacal constellation signs. And we also saw from the mosaic from Tunisia a floor design that had each month represented by the typical activity, usually agrarian, and the Middle Ages inherited that, and it will have, the calendars will feature the 12 logical or agrarian labors of the month, and for the month of July in Italy, threshing the wheat was considered the appropriate agrarian or labor of the month. These pictures of the labors of the months and the zodiacal signs were usually small vignettes, as in this 13th century illustration from also the month of July, where we have Leo at the bottom, and in this case, reaping the wheat at the top. But over time, these vignettes grow in importance, and they obviously have appeal within these prayer books. They're often the only secular element. So in this 15th century French manuscript, for the month of January, the vignettes are growing in size and importance. This is in January, we have a man feasting. Alex alluded to that activity, and the zodiacal sign of Aquarius. Over time, the labor of the month literally begins to grow, and in this mid-15th century French manuscript, the labor of the month is nearly a third of the size of the page, and this is the month of December, where killing a pig was appropriate, whereas the zodiacal sign of Capricorn is remained rather small at the bottom. A later manuscript, almost circa 1500 from France, where the illustrations for the labors of the month are nearly a third of the page in size. These are for the months of April and May. They're not very difficult work. They're more aristocratic pastimes of going out and making flower garlands in the month of April on the left and taking nice walks and gathering the flowering branches on the 1st of May for the month on the right. And then in this manuscript, which is upstairs in the exhibition, Simon Benning, the last great Flemish illuminator working in the 16th century in Flanders, decided to pump up the volume by making the labor full page in this, our Da Costa Hours. But he didn't do it just in this manuscript, he did it in a large series of manuscripts. This being the month of March, and the sky doesn't look very different from what we've been seeing today. So I started my talk tonight by emphasizing the overlap between the Middle Ages and antiquity, especially by talking about the Roman calendar, which is present in each of these calendars. But you can also, if you look at enough medieval calendars, you begin to see how the Roman calendar actually begins to literally fade away. So in this 15th century French calendar, we've got those little letters that we're familiar with now, the calends, but we've got N for the nones, Ides for the Ids leading up to the Ides, and then the Kales leading up to the calends. But you'll notice there's no numbers there. And without the numbers, the system is completely useless. It's just decorative. And then in the calendar that I showed earlier, in this one, the Roman system has actually completely disappeared. It's not there at all. And by the 16th century, we start getting calendars that we can recognize as calendars, where on the far left, indeed, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, listing the days of the week as we are very much used to it. There are no golden numbers in this calendar. There's no Roman calendar here, but it does retain the Dominical letters, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because it's still a perpetual calendar, and you need those Dominical letters to make a perpetual calendar individual to a particular year. It's also great because it has doodles, what we all used to do in our paper calendars. This is the calendar I look at every morning. My Google Calendar, stripped of golden numbers. There's no Dominical letters. There's no labors except for the work I have to do that day. No zodiacal signs, just block by block by block that I'm supposed to fill in with my appointments, and it's dismal. And I was in Rome recently and couldn't resist taking this slide of the monument that's made to Gregory XIII. I don't know if all of you know this, I think you do, but we operate under the Gregorian calendar, which is named after this guy. And it's because this pope reformed the Julian calendar, which we've heard was itself a reformed calendar by Julius Caesar. So in 1582, Gregory XIII reforms Julius's calendar, which goes back to 45 BC, because it had been noticed for some hundreds of years, the calendar was out of sync, and when they opened the calendar and consulted that golden number, they'd look up in the sky and maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow. It's like those new moons were like becoming 11 days late, and Easter was moving into summer, which is not what it's supposed to do. So my point being that living with the Gregorian calendar, which itself was a reformation of the Julian calendar, you may not know it by our ugly Google calendars, but our calendar is really old. Thank you. Alex is going to join me here, and we're going to take a few questions. And as I did mention, as Lyndon mentioned, the exhibition is open, so if you don't want to hear any questions and answers, you can go up now and catch some more of the exhibition. And it will also be over after the Q&A session here is finished.
Okay, so I see some hands up in that area. Who's going to field them?
Why don't you field?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. The question is, can I speak about the Venerable Bede and his work on the calendar? I cannot, no. And the reason I cannot is that I have not read the Venerable Bede's text, and the reason I haven't read it is because as a curator of the exhibition upstairs, I went through the manuscripts that actually were illustrated that could be beautiful to look at, because one of my rules in curating an exhibition is that I also have to have an exhibition that if you want to go and visit and see 55 beautiful medieval manuscripts, you can, and not read a single label. So I wasn't going to show an unillustrated Venerable Bede manuscript, and I didn't even read him. You want it?
Okay. Sorry, the hands are all clustered together, so there's one over here. Right.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. Are there any parallels between, did you say the Chinese calendar? Chinese and Mayan calendar and the Babylonian. I think that's for you.
I guess so. I'm not by any means an expert in either Chinese or Mayan, but the Mayan is actually, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert in that, is by standards of other ancient cultures, calendars, pretty weird. Because it brings in Venus into play, which you never find in old world calendars, which are always about the sun and the moon. And I don't know of any, I'm simply not aware of any close parallels. For China, yes, you do have lunar months. You also have the 19-year cycle is known independently of the 19-year cycle that comes from Babylonia and is also known in the Greco-Roman world. So there are similarities. There's also, of course, a Chinese zodiac, which is divided into 12, but has a completely different set of images associated with it. So there are parallels rather than influences there. Okay, there.
Okay, so the question was, when these feasts in the Christian calendar, different feasts did fall in the same year, how did they decide or what happened? I can use the example of, if you go upstairs to the exhibition, you'll see that I have diagrams discussing how these systems of feasts were controlled by, not controlled, were tracked by two systems, a system called the temporale, which tracked feasts of time, and the sanctorale. So if you look at the sanctorale diagram, you'll see the Feast of St. Nicholas falls on December 6th, let's say. If you go to the other chart of the temporale, you'll see that Advent begins 4 weeks before Christmas, and therefore around late November, early December, which means St. Nicholas' feast on December 6th is always going to fall in Advent, and inevitably it's going to fall on a Sunday, which is going to be probably the second Sunday of Advent. And when that happens, the second Sunday of Advent celebration or liturgy trumps, squashes, and pushes away the liturgy for St. Nicholas, and he's not celebrated that Sunday, but next year his feast will fall on a Saturday, and he'll be celebrated again.
If I can just give a kind of ancient perspective on the same kind of thing. In Greek cities, pre-Christian, it was not uncommon for essentially for the civil government to play fast and loose with the calendar. For example, if there's some important people visiting from another city and you wanted to make sure that they wouldn't miss an important festival, you might add some days to that month that brings it out of synchronization with the moon's phases, so that the festival would happen while these visitors are there. And then you'd have to make up for it later in the year so that when the new year begins, it would still be coinciding with the new moon. So there's just a certain amount of freedom that was taken with these things.
There's actually a parallel in the Christian calendar too, because I was working with, for instance, a Beauvais calendar that celebrates a local saint named Saint Eustace, who was a boy saint who got decapitated. And he was a very important saint for Beauvais, but his death happened to occur on the feast of Saint Luke, who's an evangelist. And if you go to a Beauvais calendar, you see that actually Eustace kicks Luke to the next day, and it means a big deal if you're a local boy saint and can kick to the next day an evangelist. We'll take one more question. Yes?
When you say celebrate, how would a person, a serf or laborer, celebrate differently from a nobleman or a person of wealth?
Okay. When I say celebrate, I'm referring to how do people celebrate these feasts was the question. By celebrate, I mean basically it's the celebration of the liturgy. So when a person would go to church on let's say, December 6th, maybe expecting a celebration or music or a liturgy about St. Nicholas, he's like, oh no, this is a Sunday, that's right. It's all going to be all about the second Sunday of Advent. So. But also these celebrations would have an impact on the secular life. So on the Feast of Mary Magdalene, she would be important enough that even if you were a laborer in the field, you probably had that day off from work. So it had secular implications as well. Thank you all for coming. Please, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.